life already feels full, and then you have a million tomatoes to harvest and process on top of that. So we're gonna share how we incorporate tomato season into our everyday life without it feeling super overwhelming, and the easiest tomato sauce recipe that you need to start making. So I remember the first year that we had a really big garden, and we had so many tomatoes. I was so overwhelmed by the tomatoes. They just kept coming and coming and coming, and I didn't know what to do with them. And so I reached out to a friend who always preserved tomato sauce. She was Italian, she made delicious tomato sauce, and she had this family heirloom of a recipe that she handed me. I felt like I was like taking a piece of her, her family culture right there, and she gave it to me, and it was like 2 pages long. It had about 20 plus ingredients, and I was like, yeah, that's not gonna happen. I had a 2-year-old and an infant at the time, and I needed an easy way to preserve all of my tomatoes that wasn't gonna involve a million ingredients and a ton of time. And that is when we came up with this recipe that is much more simple. So during tomato season, what kind of our basic days look like is I just needed a way to incorporate this into what we were already doing, right? So it is the end of August now. We're kind of slowly getting back to our homeschool routine and everything that comes with that. And I wanted to just figure out a way to seamlessly incorporate tomatoes into our everyday life. And so usually we start the day by, our normal morning chores, heading out, milking, doing everything that we normally do, having breakfast, and then I like to get out early and just harvest what's out there. Harvest whatever ripe tomatoes need to be picked, and then I go into basically, the first step of this tomato sauce recipe is roasting your tomatoes for a really long time, like an hour or so. And so I just chop my tomatoes, I prep them, and I get them in the oven roasting for that hour. That gives me a whole hour or even a little bit more to then do what we would normally do with the kids. We can do an hour, and I'm really at this point, our homeschooling routine is only about an hour anyway. And so that gives me an hour freed up to just do what we would normally do. And then after we're finished with that, as I'm prepping for lunch anyway, I can circle back to the tomatoes, finish processing them, and then start the canning process as we're eating lunch. So we have lunch going, I have the tomatoes canning on the oven, and it just kind of fits in seamlessly without it really hindering our day or feeling super overwhelming. It just kind of is just tossed right in there. So how do you preserve and process these tomatoes in this really simple way? So a lot of friends that I know, when it's tomato season and they have all of the ripe tomatoes at the same time, they just take them and throw them in the freezer and say, I'm gonna process them later. And I realized that we have tried this and it just didn't work for me personally. I think there's one, I just never really got to processing them later, and something about the texture, and I don't know, it just didn't really work with me. So my favorite way to do it is just to, when they're ripe, process them, check that off my list, and have them ready to go. I think of this time of the year as, okay, we're doing slow food now for fast food later, because then, come all those winter months, I have tomato sauce in my jar, ready to go, no work required. But it does take some work now. So the beauty of this recipe is that it really only requires a couple of really basic ingredients, mainly just a whole bunch of ripe tomatoes and like 3 basic steps. So all you're gonna do is you're gonna slice your big tomatoes into maybe quarters, maybe eighths if you feel like it, and you're just gonna line them on a cookie sheet. So make sure it's a rimmed cookie sheet. You could do a glass kind of baking pan, or I like to just use these stainless steel baking sheets with a silicone baking mat underneath it, just to help in case it kind of burns on there. It just makes it for easier cleanup. And you're gonna stick those in the oven and roast them at like 425 to 450 degrees for about an hour or a little more than an hour. And I'll link below the full post with all the exact directions and measurements and things like that. But another thing about this recipe is there really is no exactness about it. Every batch of tomato sauce that I make turns out a little bit differently depending on what spices I want to use or have on hand and what I throw in there. But the basic premises is always the same. So you're gonna roast your tomatoes at a high temperature, 450 degrees, for a good hour or hour and 15 minutes. And by doing this, It's gonna really sweeten up those tomatoes. It's gonna give them a nice like caramelized sort of flavor, and it's gonna help to dehydrate some of that water and moisture that's in there. And so they're gonna just get to a really like caramelized, sweet consistency. And from there, once your tomatoes are nice and roasted, you're just gonna blend those tomatoes up in a blender or food processor. Now, another thing that I love about this recipe is that you do not need to remove the skins of the tomatoes first. And there's actually a lot of really good benefits to doing so. One, you're just saving a ton of time and headache from needing to blanch those tomatoes and remove all the skins. But also nutritionally, the skins of the tomatoes are actually the most nutritious part of the tomato. So a lot of those really good antioxidants that are in tomatoes, the lycopene that you hear of in tomatoes is actually found in the tomato skin. So if you are blanching your tomatoes and peeling off the skin, you're actually removing a lot of the really beneficial nutrients in the tomatoes. So we like to leave those in there. But sometimes if you leave the skin on your tomatoes and then you just use an immersion blender or something like that to blend your tomato sauce, you can still kind of get that grittiness of the peel. And so this is why I like to use a really high-powered blender. We love our Vitamix for this. A food processor also works great, and using one of those sorts of really high-powered blending machines is going to basically make those skins be non-existent. You're not gonna know that they're there. You're not gonna get that grittiness in the texture. So that's what we like to do. So really, that's it. It's just roasting your tomatoes, adding some spices with your tomatoes, throwing them in a blender, mixing them up, and bam, you have about the most delicious, easy tomato sauce. And from there, you can go ahead and preserve it. So we like to can a whole bunch of this tomato sauce over the course of the next month. We'll do many dozens of jars to have on hand for the year. But if canning isn't your jam, that's totally fine. You could freeze this tomato sauce, or even it's just great for fresh eating if you're ready to eat it right now or give to friends and family or whatever you want to do with it. And again, I'll put all those canning and processing times in that blog post below so you can see all the exact details for that. But I really like to think of this season in particular as, yes, while it can be overwhelming, if you can figure out ways to just fit it into your day. So like, for example, we will only do 2 sheets worth max per day. And I have found that instead of doing like a whole bunch of tomatoes all at once, I just do 2 sheets one day. If I still have a whole bunch of ripe tomatoes the next day, I'll just do the exact same thing where I'll throw in 2 sheets worth, fill my oven, roast it, make 1 batch, and then I'll just keep doing that every day as long as I have fresh ripe tomatoes, because it's really just, it's like throwing in a load of laundry before I go do the next thing with the kids. It just doesn't require a lot of mental capacity. I just do it, get it done, throw it in the oven. It's hands off and it's easy. So while this season can feel completely overwhelming, I promise you it is worth it. It is worth just taking that few minutes in your day to slice up those tomatoes, throw them in the oven, make this really easy tomato sauce. It's really not that painful, and then you're gonna have so much good food to enjoy throughout the rest of the year. It's totally worth it. So thanks so much for stopping by the farm stand today, and we'll see you next time.